without getting into like the specific aspects of the program that will be discussed. That certainly would come up. For example, next month, there would be like a staff report and some information kind of associated with it. It would have been placed on the agenda, kind of called out so the public can see that it's coming. So, but to answer your question, like the types of topics that could be discussed where the Library Commission's advice is sought, yes to all of them or potentially. But we're not really tonight diving into those details. It's really just about that in the context of the work plan. That's one of the topics that you're anticipating working on in the coming year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could postpone the motion for item D2 until after we discuss D3. Simply because if we can't, then I think I want to discuss a little now on number 5 on the work plan and how it relates to number 2, because I do think in our discussions over the last 2 meetings, we as a commission have not quite been sure how we will proceed. And I think it might be fruitful to discuss number 5, especially at greater length as we get into the question like the ad hoc subcommittee being proposed in item D3. That just sort of the order of the meeting, it might be helpful if that's possible to postpone our motion for D2.
Anything's possible. If I could just weigh in, I guess the question would be, is there an expectation or anticipation that these work plan goals might change based on?
I think the wording could change, because I think that the number 5 sort of threw me for a little bit of I don't know exactly where it's coming from, whether the staff will engage in that or whether we might need 2 ad hoc subcommittees. And that's what I think discussing with fellow commissioners before we actually propose this, we want to tweak the language of one of the items a bit. That would be my idea. I don't think it necessarily needs to.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe there's clarification on 5. What's the timeline for that? That's in the next year, the capital improvements, or?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. So really the work plan is really intended to kind of be like a high level, here are our goals for the year, without necessarily affixing like a detailed plans or timelines to the specific goals. That's part of the work that would come. Item 5, analyze and evaluate related to capital improvements. I believe that was part of the commission's discussion. It was either last month or the month before last, I can't recall which, where this was one of the topics that the commission wanted to include in the work plan. But like the in-depth discussions about like, well, what would the timeline be? What would it look like? The specifics of that, would be for future discussion. This is really just sort of like the plan.
I thought my understanding, sorry, I can jump in, is that what you've just mentioned is what we are thinking about or plan on discussing around item 2, which is sort of what we've been dubbing informally the library of the future. Isn't that sort of more like the long-term role of the library in the community in the long term, as opposed to what's happening in the next year around any specific capital improvement or any other specific program? I thought they were kind of separate.
Yeah. Well, we could make them separate. I mean, I think the subcommittee was going to look out at, but to me, number 5 is, I guess you could put it as near term, like over the next year, what capital improvements, like do they need better cables or facility,
Right.
repairs to the restrooms. But I mean, you could word it that way, but I think because it specifically calls out this facility right here. So I mean, that's one way you could interpret it as a short-term next year needs.
Yeah, thank you for that. So maybe just a little clarity on the time frame, because I thought I heard the time frame like reference to like the specific projects sort of outlined here, but the timeframe for the work plan is 1 year.
Yeah.
Right, so including something in the work plan for the coming year implies that there will be, you know, some effort or progress toward it in the coming year. But certainly some of the projects could extend more than that, yeah.
Well, and following up on Commissioner Westcott's comment, that I would feel more comfortable if we make a motion now of just changing the wording a little bit, capture what you just said about number 5, so we're not looking at because I think you need to do the vision and the work of number 2 before you would consider whether there's something more major.
Share word version.
Anything
Sure.
More major than what Westcott, so we could we could just add the word short term potentially to number 5.
Or near term?
Near term.
Near term versus is what we've been discussing, Commissioner Westcott. Whether we set it up as an ad hoc committee or ongoing, you know, carve out, you know, 10 minutes, or 15 minutes or whatever for each commission meeting, or how we're gonna structure things is separate from near-term activities or initiatives and longer term. And
So then was there a proposed update to the language in item number 5? We have an editable version of it up here. We can track those changes.
I'll make a proposal.
Yeah,
We can add potential capital improvements in the near term. Is that?
Yeah, or potential minor capital improvements in the near term, because I mean, this is a public, I would hate
Well, we
the
don't
little
have to
council
say.
to think. I mean, yeah, we don't have to add minor, but.
Right. I mean, something happens, you know, storms in the
Well, exactly.
caves in, that's a near term problem.
And I think what's helpful about this, and this might be enough, and this is a public recorded meeting, is that I think it would be helpful to be analyzing the dollars and cents of things simultaneously to the broad vision. So I'm comfortable with here.
And is that the best place to insert those 4 words? Capital improvements in the near term, or should they go at the end of the sentence, maybe addressed in the near term?
I suggest near-term potential and capital improvements.
It does say potential here.
Potential, and then the next word after potential,
Near term, like
near-term capital improvements.
that.
Yeah.
And then
And then
not
after.
use these 4.
It's really
Does that work for everybody?
redundancy, Department of Redundancy.
So then it would read, analyze and evaluate whether and how potential near-term capital improvements to the 800 Alma Street facility may be addressed.
Do we feel good about that to
Yeah,
vote
to
on
vote.
it? Okay.
Yeah, I just I wanted to have that brief discussion of number 5 before we.
I think that's appropriate.
So would a commissioner like to make a motion to recommend the work plan? Okay, and do we have a second? Thank you, Kim. Okay. We'll give Nick a second.
As I write furiously.
Yes.
So the motion on the floor is to recommend the amended work plan goals for 24-25. I'm going to go ahead and do a roll call. Commissioner Crockett, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Herrick, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Pollock, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Schaefer, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Westcott, how do you vote?
Yeah.
And Vice Chair Wise, how do you vote?
Yeah.
The motion passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you. A full disclosure, I am a librarian and I could not let that term near term slide without putting the hyphen in. So just, I hope that's okay. We don't need another vote on the hyphen. Okay, good. Thank you for that.
So next we have item D3, establish an ad hoc subcommittee focused on the library's role in the community and the community's needs for library services. So Nick, would you like to provide a brief introduction to this item?
It will be very brief. So as you just saw in the work plan, there was discussion about having about the commission taking on this issue of under the umbrella, I will say, Library of the Future, basically taking a look at programs and services for the library, talking to stakeholders, identifying possible service gaps, and then coming back to the full commission with a report out on that. In the staff report, I just wanted to sort of put a few more, a little bit of guardrails on it, just so that it didn't turn into something that was taking up a lot of the subcommission's time, or just so that maybe we could kind of get our arms around it a little bit. But having the subcommittee come back, you could maybe discuss how many hours or how much work you would like the subcommittee to do on it, or maybe just have a timeline for when you'd like the subcommittee to report back. Is it every other meeting? Is it once a quarter? And maybe how often you would like the subcommittee to meet. Just some ways of kind of giving it a little bit more structure, so that everyone's kind of clear on that. And then if you wanted to, you could tonight actually appoint members, up to 3 members to the subcommittee. So that's my introduction.
Thank you. So before we get to the discussion, do we have any public comment on this item?
At this time, if you would like to make a public comment on item D3, establishing an ad hoc subcommittee focused on the library's role in the community and the community's needs for library services, please use that raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you are dialing in, press *9 to use the raise hand function. In person, please fill out a comment card and bring it forward. No
Any
comments
virtual
here,
participation?
no virtual participants, so returning it to the commission.
Okay. Okay, so we will open the library commission for discussion. Does anyone have any thoughts or ideas on the subcommittee?
So sorry, I always jump in first, but I'm not like on the words guardrail. I'm not quite clear on the objectives of setting up the ad hoc committee and their mandate. And do we need to discuss some of the, like, I don't know, ground rules or the framing or the basics among the larger group before we decide, let's set up an ad hoc committee to explore this, that, and the other thing?
Oh,
Should we
okay,
pull the work
I'll let you share it. Sorry,
plan so that we can-
the work plan?
Or whatever you.
We can. I think Sean is pulling up.
So to that question, I'm just pulling up this paragraph here from the staff report. And this is good. So there's a distinction between an ad hoc subcommittee, which is like, like single purpose. It kind of has a start and a finish. Once it completes its task, it then dissolves. And that type of subcommittee is one type of subcommittee. It's not subject to the Brown Act. Up to less than a quorum of members can meet, and so forth. That's separate and distinct from a standing subcommittee, which would have a much more like general charge. It's kind of ongoing. Actually, would be subject to like a Brown Act agenda posts and so forth. Based on what we kind of heard, the interest by the Library Commission, it seemed like an ad hoc subcommittee was like kind of the appropriate place to begin. And so as shown on the screen here, especially item 2 is some information that the staff would really recommend that the Library Commission discuss. What is the scope of work that you would be tasking the subcommittee with doing? What are the outputs or deliverables you're expecting from them? Is it a report out? Is it a study? Is it whatever? And then, what is the expected timeline for that? Is it 2 months? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? So those 3 pieces of information would be really critical, I think, and help the participants in the subcommittee in particular can understand their charge, and for us to be able to really define, the basis on which the subcommittee had been formed.
Mhm. So first, is everyone okay with an ad hoc subcommittee versus a stand-in? Yeah, I'm seeing nothing.
Well, and I have a question though, since Commissioner Orton, I feel like in the July meeting, laid out the idea that we would have in order to answer the questions I think you were posing, Commissioner Pollock, would have a more general discussion before, in order to define this stuff. And so I certainly am down with that, and I don't know, Nick, if you've spoken with Commissioner Orton at all. Because I know she went out and back
Yes.
about this.
Yes, I did speak with Commissioner Orton during the agenda planning meeting for this meeting. And so I think this comes out of my understanding of what she would like to do, but her voice is one of the commission's voices. So that's why it's here before you guys to see if you want to discuss and kind of set the scope of work for that subcommittee.
And I.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
I heard David had a report. My understanding is the subcommittee can kind of lead this process, but they don't have to go off into the dark and do it by themselves. So what is the question? So we could, for instance, as a set of commissioners, the subcommittee could say, who would look into this, like, benchmark against 5 libraries in the Bay Area, and that could occur as well. I mean, there can be input from other commissioners that are not on the committee formally. That's a question.
Good question. So one thing we need to be cognizant of are is the Brown Act. So
Right.
if a quorum of commissioners is discussing a topic that's related to the commission's charge, then it really should happen in the context of a publicly noticed meeting, right? So, and there's such a thing, it's called a serial meeting, where maybe 2 commissioners have a discussion that's less than the quorum. Then one of those commissioners goes and talks individually to 2 more commissioners. Now 4 have been in the discussion, even though it was not at the same time. It's still for a quorum had a discussion. That's called a serial meeting, also subject to like kind of the Brown Act requirements. So when it comes to that's where like identifying who would be the participants on the subcommittee in the full commission, having that discussion, and then identifying their scope, like what are the things, and if it's to do a benchmarking of other libraries, then to kind of call that out in the context of the full commission meeting, then the subcommittee can kind of go off and do its work and bring back those deliverables.
It is possible that you could define an initial scope for the subcommittee and say they're going to go off and work on this subject and this subject. They come back and report in 3 months, and then the commission could go, okay, now this subcommittee, we would like to go off and work on this topic and this topic, and then they would go off and do that. That way I kind of hear what you're saying is that you're worried that the sort of defining the scope of the subcommittee might keep them from having the kind of free-ranging discussions that you were having with the whole commission, or keep them from kind of going where the data led them or something. I'm not sure if I'm characterizing your comments exactly right, Commissioner Westcott, but that's kind of what I heard.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons for a subcommittee is this could take work, and I guess under the Brown Act, there's issues of even having 3 people, like, go interview. Like, there's the librarian in the Palo Alto Library who's very nationally known. So I think part of the issue is how do we operate efficiently and move this along? But
Well, I would propose, based on what you just said, this topic and this topic, is it possible to have 2 ad hoc subcommittees if we can get enough volunteers? You're saying, so like, if there are 3 commissioners who would like to investigate and one topic, and 3 others who would like to, or 2 others even, you can have an ad hoc committee, I'm assuming with 2 members. And then those 2 different subcommittees would be coming back and reporting every 2 months or 3 months. And that might achieve, both stay in line with the Brown Act and achieve sort of, what I was hearing you and Commissioner Orton in the July meeting sort of propose.
That's potentially, so you have, maybe we could have this main library of the future, what we keep calling it, subcommittee, and then next once we understand what major topics, let's say that subcommittee, first thing is to frame the whole process. Present that to the full commission, and then maybe there's a subgroup that's gonna go, as you said, Michael, to benchmark libraries and look at how other people are doing this, for cities the size of Menlo Park or large or small. And that subcommittee might only be together for 3 months or something.
Yeah, if I could, I guess one really important question to consider, maybe discuss, is what discussions or information would be exchanged or evaluated in the subcommittee that could not just be evaluated in the context of the full commission? Like, what is it about the work that really would require additional discussion in between the meetings by a smaller subset?
Well, I have an idea for a workaround, just spitballing here, is that we could even set it up, okay, the subcommittee has 3 members on it. And their first task is to get together and frame up the general, the plan for the plan.
Right.
And then at each commission meeting, you say, oh, okay, we're reporting out from the subcommittee. This is what we did. This is what we're thinking about. This is our idea for framing out, the plan over, the next, however time. We're reporting it back, it's reported back to at a committee meeting, which is a public forum. It's discussed and it's like, oh, okay, get everyone's input, and then, maybe if you focus more on this or focus more on that, oh, great idea. And then at the next, at every commission meeting, there is a report out of right here. This is where we're at. Appreciate everyone, this is what we found so far. We said it would, we were gonna investigate this and that, but it's not working out as we expected. Someone has feedback, input, and you just keep on course correcting as you go.
Yeah, both where we are in the timeline and progress and a report.
And
So I think
continue
that's-
course correction, on the
Right.
fly.
Yeah, so I think one of the, whatever, in the committee is we're talking about, he's reporting every commissioner meeting with appropriate topics, so it might sometimes be 10 minutes, it might be a half hour. My understanding is that the committee's formed to facilitate really gathering information and doing the process, it's not meant to be a decision making. It's meant to help facilitate getting information.
But that's the part of the problem that I'm trying to get my head around. What is it researching?
Well, that's
For
what we
what
have to,
objective to
that would be the
decide on
first.
what? Yeah.
that would be the first path.
Yeah, and so I would propose, I think what you sort of said already is the ad hoc subcommittee scope of work for now in this meeting is simply to lay out a framework by the
Yeah.
October meeting.
Yeah.
And that's the only output we're expecting of this subcommittee for now. And then in the October meeting, potentially, we have this. Yeah, and so what I'm piecing together from July's conversation with Commissioner Orton said, instead of doing a full commission meeting in early September, so throwing around, let's have 2 or 3 people in the next 2 months. Define the scope of work. If, spitball for 2 months and figure out whether we really want to take on something more than that.
What we
Rather than
want
in
to
this
do.
meeting, define the scope of work for the coming full year, which seems unrealistic.
Okay, so if I could though, just sort of to reflect back what I'm hearing is a subcommittee to develop its own scope of work?
No, I think this to flesh out work plan number 2 for the whole commission, and then it has to come
So,
back
so we
Uh,
could call.
I'm
it
sorry,
the
item
movie-
number 2 was
in the work
on,
plan.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, we've been calling it
That's
library of the
helpful.
future, so the work plan would be how to progress, on towards, final recommendation on library, but the work, the schedule and the tasks. is the
Even
first.
scope of work, how are we defining what we'd be looking at? That's what
Well, that's what.
I don't have my head around.
Well,
That's the
if
scope of work.
If I
Okay.
could, what I just heard Commissioner Herrick say, and I thought I heard sort of general assent within the discussion
No,
is
I think
to
it's
focus
how-
on work plan goal number 2.
No, I think what will the methodology be for tackling work plan number 2? I think, so you can just put right in front of review. Right, the methodology or how the full commission will.
Wait, but the subcommittee's gonna put together this, a proposed work with.
Exactly, right, for this only number 2. I'm saying the October meeting, if people
Yeah,
are
I know
not
that's what
realistic, but.
Then people are out.
So then, based on that, what I think I've heard and I've piped here is the scope of work for the ad hoc subcommittee would be to identify a methodology for how the full library commission will achieve, we can say make progress toward work
Mhm.
plan goal number 2. And then the work plan goal is just spelled out there, review
Yeah.
library programs and
Mhm.
services, etc.
October was the goal.
Yeah, so comfortable. Yeah, I think that's.
So everyone feels okay with that.
And then at that point, the commission, the full commission can decide to extend the ad hoc committee or dissolve it.
Or split into two or dissolve
Yeah,
it.
okay.
3 options
Yeah, I think
probably.
that's a good first step. Why not?
Yeah, that feels good. Everyone. Okay with that?
And then the only other piece of that is if you want to, at this point, assign members to that ad hoc subcommittee. No more than 3.
Well, I know Carol, but she's not here, so can you?
That's one of my favorite techniques for assigning work is whoever's not here gets assigned the work. Yes.
Our liaison to the library foundation, so she also attends those meetings, so I don't know if we also want to assign her this. I just don't know what her time.
But she can't even sit in, right? Because then you have a quorum.
It only needs to be, in order to be an ad hoc subcommittee, no more than 3 total members serving or engaging in the subcommittee. Of course, any discussion can take place at a regularly noticed meeting. So,
No, but I mean, for instance, if the subcommittee was gonna go talk to, one of the things is looking at the old plans and just trying to get our hands around what was done previously. You can only have 3 people at that meeting.
right, unless you were to
Right.
just have the discussion during the library commission meeting, which is also an option.
Right.
So the mechanism, just using that as an example, if the subcommittee says, oh, we think it would be a good idea to review old plans, and you bring that up to the general, commission and say, can we get someone to just look at the old plans? And, and
Right.
deliver it to us. So
Or have
not
somebody
everyone,
present at the meeting.
right,
Right.
and then, but the subcommittee members who meet together can be separate from, you bring a task to the general meeting and say, can someone, can a commission member
Right.
do this research, or can you engage in this activity and then submit it back, you know, to the committee?
For now, I guess we're getting ahead of ourselves, because all we're saying here is somebody's gotta come up with the task by October. So the group of 2 or 3 isn't gonna go out and get information, because they've gotta just have a work plan, basically. For October.
Yeah, and I propose, jumping ahead to, number E3 on our agenda item. I'm sort of looking as what's going on in September and October. I do think it dovetails very well in terms of, obviously, the survey that the library staff are planning to conduct is gonna be fairly crucial, I think, as parallel to the work any ad hoc such committee would do. And that's happening in September. And then reviewing departmental plan at the October meeting. So I'm wondering, Commissioner Orton sets agendas, right? It helps Nick and so perhaps we are able to leave her off of it, but if we only have 2 members who really want to do a lot of work in September and October, then they're at liberty to discuss with Commissioner Orton, right? Which would be ideal, because she would then be liaison with you, Nick, in terms of establishing.
Well, any of us can, anyone who is on that ad hoc committee can liaison with Nick directly, get it agendized for the next general meeting, and then discuss.
Wouldn't that be a violation of Brown Act? Because that's the serial meeting with maybe 4 people.
Well, Nick's not a member of the commission, he's
I
on the
don't
staff,
Yeah.
so it is possible for him to have individual discussions with commissioners, as long as he's not relaying, like, "Well, Jennifer said this and Brian said that," as long as it's not
No,
connecting.
but we're saying if the ad hoc committee had 2 or 3, and then separately liaison with Nick, that's 4.
Oh, well, Nick would not count toward.
I don't
Nick
count
is not
towards the
a
quorum.
commissioner.
Yeah.
All right,
Because the staff is a kind of different category than the commission.
Like category unto itself.
Hmm.
But I'm still a little bit lost in terms of tasks versus objectives. What are we hoping to accomplish? Why do we want to accomplish, or why are we aiming to accomplish? What we're setting forth here. So I'm not comfortable when I hear the word task or research or plan or interviews. I don't see any of that without a overriding objective, or
Mhm.
I don't know, vision statement, or, goals and objectives of, we want to do this because, future needs and, blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't have to be, all kind of, warm and fuzzy words, but it's like, why is any one given task undertaken?
Right, exactly.
What's the goal that those
Sure.
tasks can potentially?
Yep. No, that makes sense.
Against.
And that's why we're saying from here to October, that's what'll be done, not any specific task.
Mhm.
So if the committee says, okay, and then, there's comment, right? I think you should do this, or we don't need this at all.
Mhm.
So that's the first, it's just one step, but I agree.
Mhm.
After October, if the committee continues or the subcommittee, then those would be tasks and all these other active things towards the goal of,
Mhm.
is there a library of the future? What is it? Is it just renovation, or, But that's not gonna happen by October. October
Right,
is
sure.
what you're saying is,
Mhm.
what should we do? What kind of, how many activities do we think we need?
Not even how many activities, what is the objective of any
Right.
activity?
Well, all that is part of it, that objective
Mhm.
and what might, you know, a straw plan, which
Mhm.
is presented to the commission, and then, you know, there's ongoing interaction to
Mhm.
firm it up, just like the work plan.
Sure, just like your work plan, and in fact, what we've kind of taken down as your scope of work, the goal really is about work plan goal number 2, right? Which is to
Mhm.
review the services, identify gaps, advise to fill needs to achieve the library of the future. And then the specific task at hand, as we've got it here, is to develop a methodology for doing that. How are we going to do that? What are we going to review, right? How are we going to identify the gaps? How are we going to like find out the age groups? So I think everything that I'm hearing discussed does kind of seem captured in that scope of work from staff's kind of perspective. I think Nick and I are probably on the same page here. That does seem like a sufficient scope of work for the subcommittee members to say, hey, here's our goal. We're going to be we're to review these programs and services, and then our task is to come up with a plan for
Mhm.
achieving it and bringing it back to the commission. So,
Mhm.
absent the subcommittee actually rolling up their sleeves and doing the work, you're not gonna have those specifics yet, but
Mhm.
this does seem like enough to, to kind of define
To
what they're
watch.
doing. Yeah. If that works, if that kind of
Mhm.
captures what I think I heard the
Mhm.
commenters were saying.
And I probably didn't express myself well enough in terms of membership. I was just saying, if we only have 2 people tonight who absolutely want to be in the ad hoc subcommittee, it makes it easier for Carol to informally join that. We don't have to assign her, but if 3 of us are itching to do it, then it makes it more complicated for Carol to be part of those.
Well, and I'll just add that,
So-
at any point in time, the full commission can have a discussion about any item that's on the agenda in all of its glorious details. So if the subcommittee is feeling like, hey, we need to touch base with 1 or more additional commissioners above the number of 3, then the commission does meet every month.
Yeah.
And so, you can just place it on the agenda. And
Mhm.
at that point, you could even switch up the committee members or adjust the scope, or you could do all kinds of things. It's just really, the difference between what the subcommittee would do and then what the full commission would do.
I'm kind of thinking, just thinking out loud, sorry, that Chair Orton is, yes, very interested in some of these details, but she's the chair. And it's maybe a little bit easier, at the initial stage in the formulation and structuring that, others, come up with that, the scope of work and straw man, outline, what have you. And then present it at, to the full, committee, and then at that point, based, on the discussion of the full, commission and agreement, the subcommittee can then be reformulated, and it's like, oh, okay. The 2 of the 3 members can keep on going with it, but, Chair Orton is like itching to be on that committee herself, and then the other person, can drop out and then she can join without, conflict with the finance.
And we mentioned that the membership can be fluid, so.
Sure.
Yeah.
As long as you assign it,
And then-
members,
Maybe
yep.
for the first 3 months, people, and then there's another topic that in for. you
And then
switch
one
around.
person leaves and then another person
Right.
joins the subcommittee. And it could be at any point, as long as it's the baton pass, confirmed officially for the brand.
So do we have volunteers for the subcommittee?
So we passed that Have we agreed, I mean, has the subcommittee been established? Can we do that first?
I think I think you can do it all in one fell swoop. You can establish the subcommittee with this scope of work and these members in one motion.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
So hopefully it passes, so we have.
Okay.
Volunteers.
So at this point, would a commissioner like to make a motion to form this subcommittee focused on the library's role in the
Oh,
community?
does a third member want to?
Just, yeah. Going once? I'm hearing.
I can volunteer. I feel like Commissioner Ordon.
You could always jump off and.
But yeah, I would be happy to. Then September, I'm happy to jump off. Itchy to get on.
Can I make a suggestion in that regard? If there is to be an active ad hoc subcommittee, we could simply put an ad hoc subcommittee report on every agenda.
Yeah.
And then if there are comments or discussion to be had with other members of the commission, there's an item on the agenda and you have free rein to go ahead and raise the topic. And that's once a month.
Yeah, and I think you should, even
Yeah.
if it's 5 minutes.
Mhm.
The commissioner reports.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that sounds great.
So the motion on the floor is to establish an ad hoc subcommittee whose scope of work is to identify by October 24th, 2024, a methodology for how the full library commission will achieve work plan goal number 2. Then the text of work plan goal number 2. The members of the ad hoc subcommittee are to be Commissioners Westcott, Crockett, and Herrick. Did I get it all? I think it sounds right.
You so moved.
I so move, thank you. I don't have my Robert's rules of order with me.
Thank you. All right.
So now I will do a roll call vote on the motion as stated. Commissioner Crockett, how do you vote? Commissioner Herrick, how do you vote? Commissioner Pollack, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Schaefer, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Westcott, how do you vote?
Yeah.
And Vice Chair Wise, how do you vote?
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously. Thank you. I can help facilitate contact information for you three, and I'll do that after this meeting, just so that you all have each other's email addresses, and then I can let you guys take it from there. But I'm happy to arrange for or try to arrange for meeting spaces and times if you want. You don't need to use me at all if you don't want to. If you guys want to meet over coffee, that's all fine too. I'll just put it out there that I can help facilitate a little bit if you want to help some facilitation just getting started.
Okay, so informational items are transmitted to the library commission in staff's efforts to provide an update on matters of importance to the commission. Informational items are not action items. However, a commissioner, a city staff member, or a member of the public may request to make a comment or ask a question on any of the informational items. Okay, so E1, update on departmental strategic plan goal, achieve star library rating on the Library Journal Index of Public Library Service. Nick, will you provide a brief introduction to this item?
I will indeed. So this has been kicking around on our strategic plan for a while and in the Library Commission's tentative agenda planning calendar for a while. We were looking at ways when we were developing the strategic plan, the discussion was around how do we benchmark what we're doing against other libraries? How do we look for ways to kind of hold ourselves accountable to improve? And this is a report out on the STAR library system, the rating and the process for getting that rating. So the Library Journal, which is a professional library journal, publishes annually this index of public library services. They index 4 particular things: library visits, circulation, program attendance, and public computer use. Now, from some of the discussion here before the meeting started, just some sort of casual discussion going on, it sounds like maybe we want to bring this back to a more a regular item, perhaps, we'll see. But I just wanted to give you this information about sort of where we are at now, and where we would need to get in the STAR to achieve STAR library status, and kind of a little bit of background about the system so you knew what we were talking about. I did want to point out that while it measures some really good things, they have to pick things to measure, and a small enough universe of things to measure that it doesn't just get out of control. But it doesn't measure some things that might be very important for members of the community, which is how effective are our services? How are we doing them in a way that's, you know, of value to the community? Are we doing it in a way that's a efficient use of taxpayer dollars? I will point out that right now the library is ranked 120th out of almost 1,100 libraries nationwide in our budget peer group, and we are 4th highest among the California libraries in the peer group. Now, we had some discussion as staff about sort of preliminary discussion about, well, what does that mean if we're going to choose this as a benchmark? Like, what will we have to do to improve that? And then we also started kicking around some other possible benchmarking sources, including one from the Public Library Association, which has benchmarking as well. It benchmarks a little differently than the STAR library system. So I'll leave it there. It may be that we need to, if you guys want to dive into it a little more, we could bring it back as a regular item and kind of get into a fuller discussion of it. But I wanted to start the discussion going with the commission because as part of our work plan goals, staff would need to start working on it if we were going to try to make these changes. The other thing I will note is that the STAR library data lags a couple of years. So, and in fact, if you're looking at the data they're using for the ranking, it lags 4 years from now. So it's based on 2020 data, which was like right when we were getting ready to go into the pandemic. And so it's you know, it's more of a benchmark look back than a look forward for how we're doing, or even how we're doing now benchmark. So I'll stop right there.
And do we have any public comment on this item?
This time, if you would like to make a comment on item E1, the update on departmental strategic plan goal, achieve STAR library rating on the Library Journal Index of Public Library Service, please use that raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, *9 if you're dialing in, or bringing a comment card forward if you are here in person. Seeing no rush for comment cards in person and no one attending online, back to the commission.
Okay, so now we can open this up for commissioner discussion or questions.
I have 2 questions. One just about one of the numbers here. The column, the total, I assume, is that full-time employee staff.
Yes.
How do those end up as decimals?
Well, you can have, say, and we do have a half-time benefited position. So someone who works 20 hours a week. Or perhaps you had a full-time person who only worked part of a year. I think that would be the 2 ways. I would say the main way is you have benefited part-time employees, which is not super common, but it does happen. We have a slot, 1 half-time employee. We decided to try and move away from that and have been consolidating those positions over the years because it's just not as useful for us.
I had a question on how you chose to use the STAR library benchmark system. You said there were other ones, and I just wondered why this one seemed to resonate.
It's very well known. and it uses common data. I think one of the reasons the STAR library system was created was to encourage libraries to report their data and to encourage that sort of take a look at your data and see how you kind of measure up against some of the other libraries. So that's why we picked that one, because when we were writing the strategic plan, we were like, we need something to benchmark, to use to benchmark ourselves. And this one is established. It's been around since the 90s, I believe. So it's well known. But as you can see, you know, there's 1,000, almost 1,100 libraries in that peer group, and only the top 30 get that STAR ranking. So it gives you bragging rights for a year or so, and you know, people move on and off of that STAR library list.
Is there any other benefit to getting a star or star rating? Like,
We don't get any money or even ice cream or anything. No, no, I think the benefit is in the journey, in like, this is how we're doing, and here's how we do compared to other libraries of similar funding levels.
Okay, because I mean, I saw that the funding level was how, you know, the budget being 1 million to 5 million roughly. But there's such a wide variety of the service population because, you know, Carmel, California is the #1 California, but their service population is like a really small number.
I think they go per
Um,
capita.
Yeah, they do go per capita. So you're right. It can depend. So if you, all of the statistics are weighted per capita. Yeah,
Okay, yeah, and we're 3,900 people versus.
That's right.
Park with
Mhm.
the same budget serves 30.
4,000, 35,000. So roughly 10 times the amount of, and yes, there are.
I mean, hang on, we're agreeing with you. Menlo Park is better than Carmel. That's for sure, but it does sort of illustrate, you know, with any system, and this one, it's not perfect.
Yeah.
You know, I think we're back to your question about like why this one, you know, it is kind of on a national scale. It has pretty high level of participation. So there's, you know, a lot of libraries that participate in it. They do run like a feature piece about the STAR library. So it's, you know, got some, they put some resources behind it on Library Journal. So,
Yeah.
and in the absence of other options that have that scale, although we are looking at this one from the Public Library Association as well, which is kind of similar, might not be quite as robust as far as the number of participating libraries, but still enough, because our goal is really to just benchmark how we're doing with our services in a way that is like kind of just beyond like our local level and even the state level. We, throughout our library and community services department, we've been looking at different means for either benchmarking or accreditation. There is no accreditation that we can find for libraries. However, there are these benchmarks, and that's why we're focusing on the benchmarks.
I will say maybe if we achieve the STAR level, it might be a great selling point to possibly raise funds for the library.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's something to think about.
But even without the STAR rating, we're doing pretty good. I mean, I don't want to say there's no room, there's always room for improvement, but you know, without really doing what we normally do without sort of thinking about it, we're 4th in our peer group for California libraries, which is pretty good. You know, some of the things is comparing, as Commissioner Crockett said, comparing apples to apples. For instance, the San Mateo County Library System has been a STAR library in the past. Palo Alto Library and Redwood City Libraries have both been STAR libraries, bigger budgets, bigger service populations. So if we were to make a plan to improve our STAR library ranking, we would be sure to come back and talk to you guys about it and sort of give you all of those caveats, like, here's what we could do to raise our ranking. Here's what it would take to get our ranking way up here. And it may be that, you know, staff would have that discussion and it would sort of distort what we are doing or what we felt like was good service to the public to do that, to go 90 steps up.
Yeah, I think.
Because we haven't had those discussions yet internally about what it would take to do that.
That would be very interesting information, certainly on the ad hoc. Because that kind of informs what a library of the future could or should look like. And some factors that would go into it and sort of actionable ways of getting there. So that would be interesting to learn.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it also makes us think about making sure we are measuring the things that we are measuring. These are statistics that we gather and report every year to the California State Library. And that's the star rankings are taken, they take those rankings from the state libraries across the country and use them for this star ranking system.
And to the point of, what it would take to get there, if we're at 100 and ranked 120 out of 1,000 or 1,100, that's pretty far up in the rankings. And just as a quick kind of look at it, when we first were looking at this, it's like, well, does look achievable to get to the top 30 from where we are now. So it's like a realistic, could be a stretch, but it's not completely out of the bounds of possibility. So that's why we've been kind of looking at this, and we'll look a little more closely.
Yeah, I did have a question about the successful retrieval of electronic information. You highlighted it as one of the areas that needs a lot of improvement. I was sort of a two-part question. One, I was just curious what was covered under that, what actual materials and information.
I see our library super team leader, Rose Waldman, sort of adjusting in her chair. And please, Rose, jump in. My understanding is that would be things like database, magazine, and article database searches and recoveries. It's not things like just searches for materials in the catalog. It's searches for discrete pieces of information that a customer may be looking for. It's not searching for a book. It's not searching for or downloading an ebook. That's covered in a separate category.
The library will be closing in 20 minutes. If you have anything you'd like to check out, please bring it to the front now. Restrooms will be closed in 10 minutes.
And to the best of your understanding, this may be a question for after more information is known, is the part of the issue there, the materials that the library has not being things people are looking for, or is it a issue with how frequently people are trying to access those materials?
It could be a couple of things, and we haven't really taken a dive into it. The library subscribes, along with all of the libraries in the Peninsula Library System, to a suite of databases, a big magazine article, newspaper article, journal database called EBSCO, and then some smaller databases where we sort of pick a la carte, a language learning database. We had a car repair database. I don't know if we still have the car repair database or not, and several other smaller databases. But it may be a fact that in 2020, when these numbers were taken, that we didn't have an integrated search of that database through our library catalog, which we have now. So if you go to the library catalog now and you go Elvis Presley, it will ask you, do you want to search for books? Do you want to search for articles? Do you want to search for everything? And so those statistics might change, though I don't know how they are. I think what they're doing then is, if the customer clicks through for an article about Elvis Presley, they have to enter their library card number, and that's how they would assign that search as a successful retrieval of information to the Menlo Park Library.
I would find it very useful to hear, and as we hear staff reports coming up in the coming months, about whether they think it's a valid use of time based on our population, like to bring up things like public internet computer users per capita. Like, is that realistic based on the need or lack of need within this community, or whether the staff, rather than achieving the star rating, would want to focus on bringing up certain things, like whether they feel like library visits per capita and program attendance per capita. And sort of like, I guess I'm reluctant to say we need us, even though it would be helpful for fundraising to have a star rating. If we're raising or trying to raise numbers in areas that our population just doesn't need or is not going to use, then I would hate to see staff spinning their wheels to achieve that. So I would love to, once the staff really starts to engage it, there's some sort of report.
Sure. And we're happy to bring that back, and also happy to bring back a little more information on the Public Library Association system for benchmarking, to see if that maybe looks a little more, may not have the swag of the Star Library, but it might be still a very useful, and I still think this is useful. The Star Library system is useful for, you have to pick something to benchmark against. So, and these numbers, I think these categories of statistics are common across most public libraries, and I think that's why they picked those.
To Commissioner Herrick's point, and I think something I'm grappling with is like the definition of peer group and benchmarking against the peer group. If we come up with a certain definition, it makes total sense. I'm curious about like a particular service, and I say, oh, hey, I noticed, Redwood City had this program. And then I feel like I'm immediately told, oh, well, they're a bigger library and they have a different demographic, and so it's not really apples to apples. But I'd like to understand, oh, okay, well, similar demographics, similar this, similar that, like to benchmark against those cities. I know that we are peerless here in Menlo Park, but are there other, Carmel, we really can't compare it because it's not the same thing. And the other city, oh, they have more money, or they're more this or more that. What I think is great about benchmarking is finding the other cities that we want to benchmark against, and then learn the best practices of, oh, we're doing this, and or the other city that is in our peer group, they're doing I don't know, more of this service, and they have the same budget, similar demographics, similar this and that. And so that's a great opportunity to learn through benchmarking, as opposed to peer groups that are arbitrarily created that don't really fit in the services that the library is interested in.
Yeah,
That make sense?
agree. I will just caution that it can be a little rabbit hole to go down and try to find those libraries. So for instance, if you're looking at population served around 34,000 with similar demographics as far as household income as Menlo Park, you're talking about Beverly Hills and Burlingame.
But
Both
how-
of which
how
has
you're
very
Finding peer group, but in the presentation about the star rating, it's like it's against our peers, but how
Annual budget.
annual budget
annual
between
budget, but
between
necessarily
1 and
demographics or
no,
anything
between
else.
1 and 5 million annual
Oh, okay,
budget.
yeah.
Mhm.
And then they adjust the stats to be per capita. So, it's not perfect, but it gives some sense.
Okay.
Right. And being like in the top 30 is, certainly there's some distinction there to being like, say, in the bottom 30, right?
Mhm.
In a set that large. There's something there. It might not be crisp and exact to the specific ranking, but
Mhm.
good enough to give a good sense of where one library rests among other libraries of similar budget size.
Okay.
And then with specific communities, there may be certain you might not find a perfect fit community that's got all of the same features as Menlo Park. There are many things about Menlo Park that are unique, but you can find different communities that have some elements that are the same. So you might have to pick and choose from different comparison communities. Get that more nuanced picture.
But so do you do that sort of nuanced sort of comparison through other efforts besides the star rating system? Like, how do you find out that, oh, okay, Burlingame is similar demographics, so we are going to use this mechanism to find out their service profile or
Yeah, we
share
can,
best practices with others?
we can sort of through Excel manipulation, find those peer libraries.
Mhm.
The PLA tool that we are starting to look at, you can actually do that a little more easily than having to crunch a bunch of Excel sheets, which is not my favorite thing to do. But I think what you're bringing up is any sort of comparison you have to sort of discuss who you're comparing and what you're comparing so that you have an understanding of how you're benchmarking against those other comparator libraries. The STAR library system already kind of has that built in. It's just we have to express all those caveats when we're talking to the commission, or if we were talking to the public about, hey, we got a star. People go, great, you got a star. What does that mean? And what it means is all of these conditions for the ranking. So but if the commission is interested in us after looking at this as sort of a benchmark and says, what about, you know, this, that, and the other library, we could pull that together as well. Like we could benchmark just libraries in a 15-mile radius, or libraries that someone in Menlo Park might reasonably be expected to visit. Though that could go from San Jose to San Francisco and over to Hayward, which is, they're all within half an hour, 40 minutes driving distance. Very different kinds of libraries, very different kinds of service populations. So
This is a very meta suggestion, but find out what kind of benchmarking Burlingame and Palo Alto do. You know, it's one thing to, like, you know, pick up the phone and occasionally have coffee with their head of their library, or the other. But, you know, is there a mechanism sort of in the region that could be developed formally or informally that, you know, not those who are not members of the county library that are independent libraries on the peninsula to have occasional dialogue to share ideas and benchmarking informally is.
Well, it is a little more formal than that, in that all of the libraries in California, most of them participate, the vast majority, they do contribute a lot of very detailed usage statistics to the state library, which then compiles them. And that's the information that the STAR Library Journal will compile on the national level. So we actually, we do have a lot more data points than are even in the STAR Library sheet, like at the state level, which would be very helpful. So you're kind of alluding to just sort of like a regional comparison is often kind of helpful. Like, well, how are we doing with the other compared to other library systems in maybe these 3 or 4 counties, San Mateo, Santa Clara, Alameda, San Francisco is kind of its own thing, but at least those 3. So we could definitely bring that back next month just to give another taste of the type of benchmarking that's there. The state doesn't really do anything other than publish the benchmarks. It doesn't calculate a score that results in a rating or anything like that, but it does use similar data.
So does this come out, this is the 2022 index, but there's gonna be a 2024 coming out?
There'll be a 2020, the 2024 star libraries will be based on the 2022 data. So it lags a few years. So the next ones will be based, I guess, on 2021 data, though I don't know how that's going to work because that year, I mean, they will throw things out that are statistical anomalies, like they just won't include you in the ranking if you have something that's just way up or way down. So I really don't know how they're going to do the 2021 rankings because everybody was all over the place. Some libraries were completely closed, others were open, but only, very restricted hours and usage. So it will be interesting to see what comes out with the next one. They might just punt on the whole year, frankly, and just try again for the following year.
When does the next one come?
That's a good question, and I
for sure.
don't know. I don't know. Recollection is it's usually in the fall, but I'm not positive. I can find out.
Moving on to E2 then.
Quickly, the updates were there in your packet. The one thing I wanted to call out was the shingle replacement of this building's roof, which is scheduled for the end of next month, early October. So we have these shingles, which are not great for maintenance and are from 1991 at this point.
Fit through the front doors. The library opens again tomorrow at noon.
Okay. So definitely need to be replaced just because of age and wear, but also looking ahead to the city's climate action plan. There is a proposal to put solar panels, photovoltaic systems on several facilities here in the city civic center complex, and that will help get us ready for that project, which will be coming probably next year? Question mark.
So do we have any public comment on this item?
At this time, if you would like to make a comment on item E2, the Library and Community Services Department updates, please use that virtual raise hand feature on your Zoom screen. Dialing in, press *9 now. Seeing no comments.
Okay, any questions or comments about the new release? No, okay. So moving to E3, Library Commission tentative agenda calendar.
Let me pull it up on the screen here for you guys.
And do we have any public comment on the calendar?
This time, if you'd like to make a comment on item E3, the Library Commission tentative agenda calendar, use that raise hand function on your Zoom screen, *9 if you're dialing in, comment card behind me if you are here in person. I am not seeing any comment on this item.
Any questions or comments about the calendar from commissioners?
I'll just make a note that I think in an earlier discussion, it was determined to put like a report out from the ad hoc subcommittee on the next couple of agendas, so we can add those.
So in the October 21st meeting.
Yes, and I think also for the September 16th meeting as well, just so that there's something on the agenda in case there's more discussion that's desired,
can always
for example,
be,
for the chair.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Good.
A couple of things, you don't have to decide them tonight, but just want to point out that every November, well, November, December, January, February, there's always some schedule changing that needs to happen due to proximity to major holidays or actually landing on major holidays like MLK and President's Day, but that's still a few months out, but did want to call that to your attention maybe for next month to resolve
Yeah.
those.
We can
Mhm,
tackle that one.
Dive into that.
later. Yeah,
mhm.
people might have a better idea of their holiday schedule.
And then also just another call out that we were talking about having staff presentations. By that, we mean not Sean and I, staff presentations. And the first one is scheduled for the September meeting, which is the library overview. We've actually got a schedule which we can bring forward at that time of the tentative topics that we're going to cover.
Mhm.
And Rose is here to speak to that. If you're interested, I could. Okay,
There's 6 topics that we're gonna present on over the course of the next year, approximately every other library commission meeting. And all of these topics are topics that, came up in your June meetings that I was privileged to sit in on. These are all things that I heard discussed, that I thought that we could probably shed some light on as a staff. So it sounds like the conversation that we've been having today, with regard to benchmarking and, you know, similar demographic libraries, that will probably fit very well in our.
I've pulled up on the screen here a sort of sketch of the 6 topics. A library overview, library programming, users and value, outreach, budget and collection development, and then perhaps staff would like to speak about their thoughts on the library of the future as well.
Okay, that sounds great. And now moving on to individual commissioner reports. So if any commissioner would like to make a full report out on items of interest to the entire commission.
It's happily, encouraged, Nick to lead a bicycle ride from library to library and then, show off some of the, little libraries along the way that are funded by the, Library Foundation. Not a lot of people showed up, but I think it's more important to just kind of get the word out and in the city messaging, it shows up on social media that such things are happening. In September, I believe there'll be like the back to school sort of like bicycle repair with safe routes to school, folks or some sort of planning along, along.
That's our
those
hint.
lines. But just, Bellhaven, campus, does a lot with area youth and, bicycle repair and, rides, throughout through the neighborhood after school. So I'm just looking forward to finding ways that the library can work with Safe Routes to School and youth and the community and just, build up community further through bike riding, which I just personally enjoy.
It was fun.
Show and tell.
It takes 20 minutes at an easy pace to ride from this library to the Bellhaven Library. So it's faster than driving on Willow Road during rush hour.
frankly, walking probably.
Yes, yeah, I know. That's what I feel like whenever I get stuck on Willow Road.
Okay. So with that, the meeting is adjourned at 8:03 PM. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
You don't have a gavel.